Welcome to LCC Radio, WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. You're listening to Lansing Online News Radio with Bonnie and Bill on a hot summer evening in Lansing. I was just down at the Capitol watching a little bit of the vagina monologues before I got here. I guess I can say that on LCC Radio, although I guess you can't say it in the House of Representatives.
Anatomically correct. I guess you can.
Any of those V words got women in trouble last week.
You know what I found is really interesting is that one legislator who said he doesn't use that word in mixed company, and it got me thinking, so where does he use it? How does he use it?
How does he use it?
Yeah.
Well, I suggested if you go to Lansing Online News, you'll see the article I wrote that it really mixed company means that Republicans don't want to hear things like that because they're sort of sniggering little boys, but Democrats are mature enough to handle the words. Barb Byram was there as well. The word that got her in trouble, she figures, was vasectomy. So it is those V words. But we had Eve Ensler here tonight, hosting on the Capitol steps a reading of the vagina monologues in honor of Representatives Lisa Brown and Barb Byram, who were silenced last Thursday, the last day of the session. They were unable to speak to certain bills they really did want to comment on, by the way, because of comments they had made as the super abortion bill went through. What happened was the week previously there had been a hearing in the Health Policy Committee at the House of Representatives where a number of women were prevented from speaking, and it caused quite a flurry. I had done a video on it. The video got picked up by Rachel Maddow's blog. That brought 5,000 hits overnight. A lot of women were energized by what happened by that and frustrated at the idea that women's voices were not being heard. And that really culminated in the vote last week, then on Wednesday, that the bill was rammed through without allowing people like Lisa to really fully address what she wanted to talk about. And also Barb Byram had wanted to introduce a sort of clever amendment where if men were going to regulate women's vaginas, she wanted to regulate vasectomies and make sure that men had to go through all sorts of health checks before they could get a vasectomy.
She should have used vas deferens.
I guess yes. But it turns out those words are already in the congressional record at the legislature, so I don't know why they were a big deal.
I'm not sure why they went through that process. The legislature, that was silly.
It really was. I think what was even more worrisome, however, is that we're seeing all sorts of things rammed through using that same sort of tactics.
That's the important issue.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're all important issues. That we're watching the dismantling in many ways of things in this state that really mattered. While it was the vagina monologues issue that got all the major attention that week as well, I was on the House floor on, I think it was Tuesday afternoon, and what I watched go through were, they call them the election reform laws, but in reality they're voter suppression laws. And what we're seeing is that there's a package of bills that would really make it, they're trying to enshrine a sort of permanent GOP majority here and at the national level, by really making the obstacles to voting so difficult that large swaths of the population, primarily those who would vote for Dems, are going to find themselves surprised when they get to the polls this fall and find that they're not eligible to vote.
That's going on in a lot of states.
All those Midwestern states that have new GOP governors.
Right.
John Kasich in Ohio and Rick Scott down in Florida. He's busy doing that as well. I mean, when we saw how few votes in 2000 made a difference in Florida, being able to purge the rolls of tens of thousands of voters obviously is going to have an impact.
Absolutely. It will have an impact in Michigan.
It certainly will. And those bills are rolling right along. They're certainly on the fast track. I think the uproar with the abortion bill, the super abortion bill, was such that I'm not sure that one's going to roll through the Senate the same way that it did through the House. I think the House wanted to vote on it now. Before the primaries, plenty of people who were up for election wanted themselves on the record. That frees up some money from groups like Right to Life for them by being vocal supporters of these kinds of bills. But I really wonder whether the backlash is so ferocious.
They're not going to tell you.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, I mean, they're not going to tell you what kind of email they're getting and letters and phone calls, but it has to have some backlash.
Well, I watched Jace Bulger's press secretary, Ari Adler, come out with a sort of succession of press releases trying to explain why those women had been censured, and none of them really held water. I think they're backpedaling a bit now, so I don't know if the rest of it's going to go through, but we'll see. They certainly haven't shown much restraint before this.
No, and like I said, I think that was a mistake on their part, and maybe it's a mistake to continue to talk about it to Republicans. I mean, I hate to say it, they just need to walk away now, because they can't dig themselves out of what they did.
The good news for them is that they don't come back until September. And so there's this long period of time where people who do have short memories, and they'll be off on summer vacations and so forth. But I noticed Susan Demas had a good column in M Live that talked about the fact that what exactly is the GOP trying to do? Cost itself suburban women voters? War on women issues are still pretty hot.
Absolutely, and I think even they cross party lines, clearly.
Yeah, and the independent women, the ones who make up their minds.
And women are probably still a majority of the voters.
Yes, they are, in all states and nationally. That's why President Obama is still doing as well as he is. I think it's women who are continuing to do that. There was a good turnout tonight. I'd say maybe 1,200 to 1,500 at the Capitol, which is not bad for, what was it, about temperature about 212, boiling maybe?
And it's a Monday night.
It's a Monday night.
It's not a good time to do an event.
No. But anybody listening, I'd hate to tell them to abandon their radio, but get that nice little portable earbud, keep us in one ear, and you can go down to the Capitol. And still, I guess the performance is going to go on until about 8 o'clock tonight, so it must be cooling off a bit by now. But there were plenty of women out there being loud and raucous, which was good to see. I was surprised at the number of young women, because part of what I think has happened to the feminist movement is that when you look at the membership rolls, most of them are older women who have vivid memories of how grim it was before this legislation, before Roe v. Wade. Many of us were trading stories yesterday. We met informally at Ron Wired, the local Lansing Area Now chapter, and we were talking about some of the real horror stories that had gone on. I mean, people who had almost lost their lives with back alley abortions, people whose lives had been changed forever because of lack of access to therapeutic abortion. Really grim stories, and I think young women still haven't heard many of those.
Certainly, almost anyone under 30 hasn't heard those stories if they had to deal with it.
Yeah.
So it's not in their moral context at all.
It isn't, and I can understand why. They hear arguments about the sanctity of life, and they think about little babies, and they're at that age where they're really in a sort of maternal glow, and it seems like a wonderful thing. Unfortunately, the logic is that you don't really stop abortion if you overturn Roe v. Wade. What you stop are legal abortions, and then you have all the ones that are so dangerous.
And and I think birth control devices are more readily available than they were in our generation.
And better.
So they're not worried about it as much.
Yes, absolutely. I think that they feel much more in control, but there are circumstances where they can find themselves.
Absolutely. And if they're possibly working for a university that's owned or a college owned by a Catholic church, by their own.
Well, it's going to be interesting. This is the week we may hear on Obamacare, where young women will find out whether the healthcare policies that we have will cover contraception or not. So, what do you figure? What's your bet on the Obamacare decision?
Boy, those are tough ones. I don't know what.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that she had said there were sharp divisions.
I just don't know. Boy, that's a tough one.
I know. But I think they'll probably make that their last decision that they announce.
I think they will side with the church.
Do you really?
Yes.
Well, side with the church on. They're not really deciding. They're deciding the mandate.
Yeah. But the majority on the court is Catholic.
By far. Yeah, it's really not representative.
Conservative Catholics. Not Dorothy Day Catholics.
No. Opus Dei.
Opus Dei Catholics.
Well, they are. They're members of Opus Dei, and that's a very conservative Catholic.
So that's why I think they're going to go Catholic.
I think you're probably right. That's going to be an exciting summer then, isn't it? Well, back down to the Capitol. Get Eve Ensler back. Maybe we could just move her in here permanently. Many things begin and end at the Capitol. Here's a clumsy segue for you. We're now going to move into talking with our first guest this evening. Jim Carter is an old friend of mine, and he was very much involved with the first ever Lansing Marathon. Tell me a little bit about how you got involved, and it turned out to be quite a successful event. I was out there on my little road taking pictures at one of the aid stations out there. It looked like everybody was really well organized. Everything went. See, we didn't kill anybody. That's always a good thing.
Very good thing.
Yes.
I think I kind of stumbled into the whole mess. Actually, it was a little messy at the beginning because of a lot of communication and getting the right people in the right positions. But it turned out to be, like you said, a very good event, especially first year. The event itself went off very well. Weather could have been a little better, but you're always rolling the dice with marathons and temperatures and wind and all that sort of thing. But pretty much it was very well received.
But tell me a little bit about your background. You and I go back to the old days of the Crystal Air Running Camp. That was always fun. We did that up at Ludington for many years.
That's right, yeah. I started running in high school back in the 60s and kind of kept with it since then. And it's been going through several stages, obviously, since high school and early 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond. So,
how many marathons have you done? You've done quite a few.
Probably 80-some. But that's over many years. So it doesn't.
I would hope. If you did them all this year, Jim, you're in real trouble.
There's some guys that do that. But,
there's somebody running a marathon a day.
Oh yeah.
There's always some whacked out thing going on in running.
A little overkill.
Yeah. Of the ones that you have seen, and you've certainly seen more than your share, which ones stand out? What makes a good marathon?
Well, Boston, because of the historical context, and it's a good crowd, got a lot of history to it. Spectators are great, and it's a world-class field there every year. So that's a good one. I've been to New York once, Chicago once. They're both pretty good events. My take on it these days, it's a little too crowded for me, but typical middle of the pack runner, that's fine. They're out there to have a good time and stay fit and all that. So it's pretty good there. Some of the smaller marathons have been pretty good too. Grand Rapids has a very nice marathon in the fall. Detroit attracts a lot of runners, obviously.
Yeah.
Columbus is a very good marathon in the fall.
I've heard good things.
Yeah, very good. Yeah.
Now, what will it take? This was the first year for an event, and that's a tough year because there's so much that logistically has to be set up. I think some of the people who got involved early on didn't realize what kind of task they were getting involved in.
Yeah, Owen Anderson, the race director, I think did a wonderful job of maybe 6-8 months to go. He started really listening to people and taking their advice, and it's a big collaboration. And it turned out pretty good. He got the right people at the right time, and volunteers were fantastic. He had a good volunteer crew, which is always important, especially for a marathon. And the important thing is he got the support of the city of Lansing, and that was a big deal.
Blue Cross Blue Shield came in across for them. I mean, there was really a commitment there. I was pleased to see that. That's rare.
Yeah. First year, it was a miracle in my mind. But the nice thing is it's established now, and I think the thing will only grow at this point.
How big do you think it will ultimately grow to be?
It's hard to tell these days. I think there's actually 3 races he had, a 5K, half marathon, and a marathon. I think he had a little over 2,000 for everything, which is kind of what I predicted going in for a first year event. So, he could easily go to 4,000 or 5,000 and beyond. I always tell people if they're putting on those kind of events, make it a 5-year plan.
Right.
And I think you could see 5,000 to 10,000 in 5 years. There was a marathon over in England, Brighton, England. They had their first marathon 3 years ago, and they're expecting to hit 10,000 this year. So it's population.
They're still booming.
Yeah, population density is a little different over there, but it's not out of the question.
Have they set the date? It's gonna be on the same weekend, or
the same approximate date. I haven't talked to Owen yet. I've been doing a lot of traveling and haven't had enough time to connect to him. But yeah, same general time.
This is LCC Radio, WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. We're talking with Jim Carter about the first ever Lansing Marathon. Jim, I used to be married to a gentleman known as the Duck, and well remember putting on the Duckathon and always sweating bullets during the event if the thought somebody was out there passing out on some corner and somebody's going to run them over. Then we did the Bud Light Big Ten triathlons so that I had an opportunity to both drown them and run them over with cars. I mean, just it wasn't good enough to just run them over with a car. You could drown them too. Oh, good.
Unless you were in fresh water, so a shark wasn't about to get one of them.
God. I mean, they are really tough event. I mean, you really have to know what you're doing, or you could hurt people.
Yeah. Well, one nice thing about Owen is he had a good vision from the start.
I see.
And that's very important in my mind. You know, what's the long-term vision? You know, he's trying to help out some of the Kenyan runners. He has some charities that he set up over there with orphanages and younger people, and then also the charities within this area too.
Yeah.
So that potential will make a big impact in the years to come as well.
Most of the most successful marathons that I've seen have some sort of affiliation with a charity where people can raise money for the charity. I think that's a wonderful tie-in. It gives opportunities for groups in the local community to get involved. It really has a lot of positive spin-off in the community.
Yeah, and I think too from a fitness standpoint, the more people you get involved, sometimes it's like a salmon going upstream in terms of the health condition of the average American and what some of these marathon runners are getting themselves into. But, it can only be a positive event from that perspective as well.
Well, you over the years have become very interested in sort of the mind-body health connection. And what kind of information and advice would you give to people? Because you have, you started out as really sort of a very, very dedicated runner, but you've developed a sort of spiritual side to this as well.
Well, oddly enough, I was at a USATF, United States Track and Field Federation, what they call a level 3 coaching clinic about a year and a half ago. Level 3 is very specialized. It's top of the pile in terms of what you're learning and everything. And one of the presenters there was a guy by the name of Joe Vigil, and he was a U.S. Olympic coach for long distance for several years. And when he started his presentation, the first thing he said was, "Humans are aerobic animals," and a lack of aerobic capacity basically knocks off your neural patterns. And you get what he called clouded consciousness as a result. So it goes beyond just the physical fitness. And if you get into some of the research that's being done, you start talking about neuropeptides and serotonin and all these kind of things. So they all kind of play together. And so the old Greek, I think it was the Greek saying, healthy body, healthy mind. So it's a good combination.
Yeah.
Yesterday I interviewed Scott Jurek, who is one of the world's greatest ultra marathoners, which means 50 miles an hour. Well, it actually means anything over a marathon, but typically 50 miles and over. And he has that same opinion. He ran with, you might have to correct me, is it the Terra Herma Indians, which is an indigenous
in
Indian
Mexico.
In Mexico, that all they do is run. They run constantly, but it has become part of their life, and they don't do it basically for fun. It's their lifestyle.
I see.
They're doing it to live.
Well, they keep talking about runner's high, and I'm not sure that's really accurate in the sense that, I ran enough in earlier days to be able to feel a mental sort of clarity, but I wouldn't call it as, I understand why it's addicting, but it wasn't that kind of high that, as opposed to smoking a joint type high. But it was a kind of thing that it really does provide you an opportunity. Many of the best thoughts I've ever come up with have come while I'm running.
Yeah, in fact, there's a book out now called Imagine, which talks about creativity, and there's a little tidbits in there about maybe it's not even the physical exercise sometimes, but it's getting away from whatever you're trying to solve, and all of a sudden the answer pops out of nowhere.
Like lucid dreaming, only when you're awake.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So when you do these long runs, one of the challenges is I really didn't find myself getting bored. People talked about exercise being boring, but I always found that I liked being alone with my thoughts out there when I was running.
Yeah, I can't understand why people put on these headphones and go out. 'Cause
Isn't that terrible? I got used to that, and you know what happened is in those years I turned off my car radio, and I don't listen to the radio in the car anymore because it's you get used to your own thoughts. It's Anne Morrow Lindborg wrote a great book called Gift from the Sea about getting rid of that noise you put in your ears all the time, and I think that's one of the benefits exercise gives.
When we were coming back from New York last week, we were waiting in the New York LaGuardia Airport, and the day before they had some national events in New York City for young, especially young women. I think they had 14 of the top milers in the country there. And most of them were leaving from the airport that morning. It was interesting to listen to them talk. But coincidentally, the woman who was qualified for the marathon, the Olympic marathon from Michigan, showed up. And she was like holding a little clinic with him right behind us.
Oh,
it was so cool to watch.
Oh,
and she's
great.
like, I think she's 30 something, so she's talking to 17-year-olds,
wow,
giving him advice. One thing I remembered, it had nothing to do with mind body, but she was telling him, when you pick your college, pick it for something you want to do, not what your parents want you to do. And I'm thinking, whoa, watch these parents run. It was really interesting.
Move along.
Yeah. Oh, nice. Thank you for coming. Yeah, it was interesting.
So what kind of advice would you give to people trying to get in shape in this hot weather?
Starting from ground zero, in the morning.
Yeah, that would be a good idea.
Do it in the morning or late afternoon, maybe even late evening. This time of year where you got a lot of light stuff.
Yeah.
And don't push it. If you haven't run before, walk and run for 20 minutes, turn around and come back, and do that until you can run the whole thing.
We've learned a lot over the years. It used to be that we were always pumping water into people, and now we're finding out that may not be the right thing to do, that you can overhydrate and underhydrate.
Yeah, there are a lot of people have died in races from that very.
I had a friend that almost bought it in the Traverse City Marathon over drinking.
Oh, yeah.
And it was hot. I mean, it was like 95 that day.
Well, I was so clumsy, though. I was doing the Ludington Half Marathon, and they would come, you'd have the hose. I was drowned. I thought, this is going to look bad. I'm going to drown in the middle of this run.
I could never drink and run.
No, I can't do it. I'm choking and
gasping. It was too hard.
Yeah, so it's not easily done sometimes.
Most marathons I've run, very good ones back years ago, if it wasn't too hot, you never drank water.
You didn't.
I talked to everybody my age.
You really shouldn't have to.
Yeah. It's interesting, though, to talk with elite runners or people who are close to that category, because there is an ability to deal with physical pain in a different level than the rest of us do, I think.
Yeah, I think, too, there's a fine line between extreme discomfort and pain. And I think what you mentioned now, Bonnie, is the top athletes can push that, severe discomfort and work through it.
Right, and that's a mental discipline as much as a physical one, because most of us reaching that point, our mind will say to us, you're doing something wrong, stop doing this, yes, and we will stop dead in our tracks. But the elite athletes have the mental capacity to push through that.
Right.
And I don't know where that comes from. I don't have it, so I can't.
Well, some of it's trainable.
You think so?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, you keep adding to your discomfort in every training session.
I see.
You can push it out, but there is, at some point, the elite athlete has an ability to do that more than anyone. I mean,
Jim
it's
used
just
to put
something
on
I don't
running,
think you can train for.
Jim used to put on the Crystal Air running camp, and I've heard Lindsay was the guest there many times at the time when he was runner of the year. And he talked about how he went to where they train racehorses and looked for the techniques that they use then to cool down the horses and so forth, and be able to get them to push to their maximum. And he was adapting that to his own running.
Yeah, I think one of the techniques he used was walking in cold water afterwards, which is what they do with racehorses quite often.
Yeah, to cool them down.
Yeah,
get the core temperature down.
But it gets the circulation in the muscles going, so it flushes out all the the byproducts more quickly.
Now, I had a handy home fire that cost me 2.5 years research on the book I was doing.
My fault.
It was for his wedding reception. I was doing all this prepping of the house. And can I give our little friendly listeners a hint? Spend the extra $2 on the non-flammable zip strip. I thought I saved the $2 and I cost myself my home as a giant charcoal briquette. And I lost
the fire was an omen. I should have picked attention to.
Well, that's true. The marriage went up in flames shortly thereafter. I had 2.5 years research on a book that was going to be called Best Available Evidence, looking at some of the scientific evidence about what the physiology of running really does to the brain and the body. And it is fascinating. I mean, at the molecular level, you start getting down there, and it is incredible the impact it has. Now you went, but you brought your drawing here to.
Yeah, this is. I wasn't sure what we were going to get into tonight, and this, as I mentioned before the show started, is a depiction of Ramses II, Egyptian king from probably 5,000 years ago. And for the listeners out there, if you can picture this.
Well, there's the webcast. You can hold it in front of the camera.
Just hold it right up.
Okay. It's got the gentleman Ramses in his chariot, being pulled by 2 horses, and he's got a bow and arrow, and he's ready to pull it back. And the deeper significance of this, and there's other traditions that have used the same model, so to speak, is that from a health standpoint, it's amongst other things, it's a perfectly balanced human being, in the sense that the chariot, which represents the body, is in good shape. The emotions are nice and healthy and well trained.
The beast pulling you along.
Yeah, and the intelligence has its purpose set out, or its aim, so to speak. And this guy is so good that he can control his emotions at gut level because he's controlling the horses with a rope tied around his waist. So it's and when you get into the health aspects, or when things go wrong, if you have a busted chariot, you're not going anywhere.
Well, there's that.
And as our friend Herb Lindsay tells his kids at school, if you don't take care of your body, where are you going to live?
That's a good. I like that.
And then emotions with the horses. If those run wild, you're going to go places you probably don't want to go.
Well, that's true.
Or if they aren't maintained good, they're not going anywhere.
That's right.
And intelligence, I guess you could say the psychologists that deal with cognitive, approaches. Okay, what are we aiming at these days, and that sort of thing. The interesting thing about this too is this. There's this little bird right here that's flying above it, and you can frame that any number of ways. Some people say, well, it's the higher self, which is the real you, or whatever, because all this other stuff is going to go to dust at some point anyway. Yeah. But this guy's still around, and if you notice, he's carrying a little symbol of life there.
Oh, so, very cool.
Yeah, so he's directing the whole thing.
The Egyptians were tricky.
They were also smarter than we are, I think.
Yeah.
Because what you're really suggesting, as you had earlier framed it, is the ultimate goal is balance.
Yeah.
Because if you don't balance the emotions and the body and the mind, and then if it gets out of whack, which is what I see some people doing when they try to make a dramatic change, they get addicted to running. They get themselves into lopsided sorts of interests. So that's part of the challenge.
Right, yeah.
Now, you've always been on that kind of spiritual quest to try to marry the two. Where have you ended up?
How many hours?
A book.
Yeah. I've been very fortunate in the last decade or so to be at the right place at the right time. So it's opened a lot of doors that in Laconia, Turkey.
Oh.
Yeah. The poet Rumi is buried there. And I didn't plan on going there, but it ended up there, so to speak.
Fortuitous accidents.
Yeah. And that's an interesting place right now because there's a best-selling author from Turkey. I can't remember her name, female. And she did a historical novel about the life of Rumi. Oh. And there's women just pour into the place right now.
Yeah.
It's kind of an interesting.
I saw a Rumi quote on Facebook yesterday. It was quite appealing.
Yeah, you posted it.
Yeah. Looking It's interesting because I think that's what happens to people. You know, you may spend a certain portion of your life concentrating on the physical, and then ultimately you end up marrying the physical and the mental.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, make sure to come back and tell us often about what's going on here in the Lansing area, what's happening and running, and also just talk about in general how we're all sort of moving along.
Yeah, I think the challenge right now is, in terms of the fitness of this country, it's kind of lopsided,
I agree.
where you got all these people pouring into marathons right now, but there's still a small proportion
And
of
but the percentage of obese,
is going skyrocketing. Yeah,
and it's going to bankrupt us.
yeah, and then getting back to the clouded consciousness thing, it's
You don't think very well either.
yeah, it's hard to make good decisions when your consciousness is clouded up.
Perfect segue into the next discussion that we're going to be having with also another runner. We're being joined here. I better do my station ID and explain that this is LCC Radio, WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. We'll move Ray in a little over this way, move everybody over a little bit because we are webcasting on www.lansingonlinenews.com. Ray Holman is a runner as well, yes?
Yes, most definitely. Just ran 7 miles last night.
Ooh.
And it's a big part of my life, so it's great being on the show today because running's huge part of my life as well.
Perfect. But what is also talking about balance, you also represent the UAW and in particular the public sector workers who, based on what we were talking about earlier, we're really taking a beating in this state and getting out of whack in terms of the balance that we used to have between the power of the corporation and the power of labor. And they were never evenly matched. Corporations always had, huge amounts of money compared to what the unions ever had. But we're seeing that get out of balance more and more. What's happening now since in this post-Wisconsin world? You've been up to Wisconsin before. How did that come down? Why did that go the way it did?
I think when you look at what happened in the Badger State, there was $31 million that came in from all over the country to help keep Governor Walker in power, and it worked. Both sides had a good turnout. As you mentioned, we did have a team of Michigan State employees in Wisconsin back in February 2009. And that, that was a great experience. And I still want to say what the good folks did in Wisconsin. It was still important, even though, it was pretty devastating to see that Governor Walker stayed in office after taking away people's collective bargaining rights. But still, to see the energy and the example that those workers, those teachers, state employees, and also private sector workers did is still something that, I'm really proud of them.
It was inspiring, I thought. I mean, I saw the footage. I wasn't the person, but I saw the footage on TV, and I remember how energized you were after you'd gotten back from, Wisconsin and talked on the Capitol steps here. And there did seem to be a real energy around the issue that we have to prevent this from happening. But it seems we've barely been able to slow it down. What are these new rules going to mean here in Michigan? What kind of bite are we going to face?
Well, just last week, there's a bill, for example, and there's many bills. There's over 80, 90, what I would say are bad bills. But for example, today I wanted to bring to everybody's attention Senate Bill 704. You may ask, what does Senate Bill 704 do? Well, that bill would fine a public employee $1,000 a day for participating in a picket or a strike. It would fine a collective bargaining unit $10,000 a day. And, in Michigan right now, it's illegal for public employees to strike or, for a state employee to block an entrance to a building. But to increase a penalty to $1,000 a day really sends a chilling message, I believe. And, it really goes against our First Amendment rights here in Michigan. And it's just an example of some of the real punitive legislation that we're seeing. The other thing, too, we're seeing is this real rush to privatization. Another bill I wanted to bring to your attention is House Bill 5658. And what does that piece of legislation do? That allows corporations to go into prisons and hire inmates for 15 cents an hour. Now, allegedly, this legislation says that the goods and services that are provided have to stay within the correctional system. But I think it really opens the door for a lot of abuses. We're allowing private companies to come in and hire inmates for below minimum wage. I mean, that really reminds me of going back in time.
Or going to China.
Right,
That's right.
absolutely.
And those are just two things that are coming through committee right now in the state legislature. And these are the type of things that are being pushed through, and there's really not a whole lot of chance to talk about them or to debate them. We had talked about earlier in the program two state representatives that were not allowed to speak about some particular legislation regarding reproductive rights or women's rights. And the same thing's been happening with labor issues.
Absolutely.
And it's really scary, actually. It's something where you really can see that one day we could wake up and not really have a lot of rights here in Michigan. And that's why it's so important for people to get involved and to realize that if you don't pay attention, your rights can be taken away from you. And in fact, they're happening right now.
I'm stunned at, PA4 here in Michigan, that really made a difference. That was, I think, one of the biggest problems that you faced. Tell us a little bit about the impact that's had.
Well, the emergency manager law basically allows, dictators to come in and take over cities, take over school districts that are having financial problems. And in fact, just recently, a few weeks ago, I was in Detroit protesting out front of Southwestern High School. And this is a school that does very well. It's a public school, does very well. In fact, it was State Representative Rashida Tlaib's home school. And we were out protesting because behind closed doors, the decision was made to close that school. And that was going to impact, the students and the parents in that neighborhood. And that was something that was done with no input from the community. It was a decision that's being made by the emergency manager. Yeah. And then when I think about the fact with this legislation 704, I could have been fined potentially $1,000 for going down and standing with State Representative Rashida Tlaib saying, making these backroom deals isn't right. And so you see where everything comes together and how it fits. And what the plan is of some of the far right Tea Party legislators that unfortunately are controlling at least the state house for sure in Michigan right now.
I went and videoed when I've seen some of these gentlemen in action. I've seen Representative Ajema with his hearings on Sharia law. As if they were in real danger. I was talking when we were talking last week with representatives of the Muslim Center. When the population of the United States is 1% Muslim, it's really hard to do a takeover. So I don't think we have to worry too much about Sharia law. But instead of dealing with the real problems of the state of Michigan, all this time is wasted on a lot of this legislation that is either off point or it rolls back things that people don't want to see roll back. But at the same time, we're also seeing, I think the big challenge and the thing that sort of frightened me about what happened in Wisconsin is that these laws also take a financial bite out of the unions, and that makes you less able to be the counterweight to that corporate power that we've been talking about.
Yeah, that's right. It's a good point. It's almost like the Cold War, right? And we're both sides are using our resources to fight this political battle. Yeah. And in Wisconsin, it was unfortunate that Governor Walker maintained power. But then when you look at Ohio, SB 5, they were able to repeal that law that took away collective bargaining rights from many public employees. Oh. And so it's not all gloom and doom. There was a victory we had in the Buckeye State. And of course, here in Michigan, we're going to be attempting to change the state constitution to protect collective bargaining rights as well. So it's going to be real interesting to see how this whole thing plays out, and a lot of strategy and messaging is going to be really important. But again, there's no doubt about it. Facing big money is a huge challenge for us in the progressive movement. And of course, we're in the Citizens United world now where there's unlimited spending and corporations are allegedly people. And so the challenges are going to be immense. But Joe, here in Michigan, November is going to be huge because the state house is up for election and there's 110 state representatives. Right now, there's 64 Republicans and 42 Democrats, I believe. And there needs to be at least 10 seats flipped in order for the Democrats to take control back. And the reason that's so important is we have one party that controls all branches of government.
Absolutely.
State Supreme Court is 4-3 Republican. Attorney General, Secretary of State, Governor, Senate, on and on. So as we go through this presidential election, it's really important for people to educate themselves and why it's really important to vote for your state rep and what's at stake here. Because what's happened is And I think what a lot of people are finding out just this week is when you don't have a backstop, people can do essentially whatever they want, and that's a problem. We haven't had a backstop. When you control one branch of government,
Yeah.
you can at least stop stuff, and we have
Right.
not been able to do
You
that.
can't even slow it down here.
That's right.
Yeah,
You can't even they don't even allow people to speak.
I was there at the hearing where the woman from Mount Pleasant wanted to speak, and when they wouldn't let her, she was really about to. I mean, the sergeant at arms in the room, the security in the room was really trying to shut her up, and she just kept screaming, "You've got to listen to me." I mean, they tried to cut off they only gave 90 minutes for the hearing. They cut it off 10 minutes early, and said, "Well, we'll just read your cards next week." That kind of thing. I mean, there was an arrogance there that I hadn't seen before, and it's really worrisome. It's as if we've won the ball game, we own everything. We've got all the marbles, we can do what we want.
Ray, what do you think the type of money and the amount of money you'll be spending in Michigan to fight against collective bargaining?
Millions and millions. It's going to be huge. Millions and millions. And, I should say right off the top, that particular drive, the Protect Our Jobs campaign, their own organization, they have a campaign chair and their own spokesman. So I'm not really authorized to speak about the drive itself. But I can tell you, based on what happened in Wisconsin, what happened in Ohio, millions and millions of dollars is going to be spent. And, it's going to be a big TV war. There's no doubt about it. Unfortunately, the Koch brothers and Chamber of Commerce and some of those other groups have a lot of money to spend. And they've shown a willingness to do so.
I was listening to Mitt Romney, whose dad was governor here for many years, and you would think he would have a real sort of feel for the common working person here in Michigan, talking this last week about the fact that, well, we don't want big government, and that means that we don't want to be hiring any of those firefighters, police, teachers, construction workers, because we want smaller government. And I thought to myself, how quickly did we demonize those groups? Those were the groups that were our heroes. They were the working class heroes. They were the people in the community that everybody respected. I mean, my goodness, you wouldn't say things like we don't need more teachers. Who in their right mind would say we don't need more teachers? And how does he get it? How's that an applause line?
It's so true. And, for example, in the budget that just passed, the fiscal year 2013 budget, they actually cut 126 parole agents out of the budget. And Michigan has 4 of the top 10 most dangerous cities. And we really have a hard time working with people coming out of the facilities, reintegrating them back into the communities, and then to cut parole agents. And parole agents wear 2 hats. They're law enforcement, but they're also social workers. And to cut 126 parole agents out of the budget makes no sense. And that's just a small example of what's happening statewide. And, really, things are going to start to collapse in on themselves. We don't have enough, I'll be perfectly blunt. In some of our cities in Michigan, we don't have enough policemen anymore.
No, we don't.
We don't have the classroom size is increasing. There has to be a balance. We want a government that's efficient, that works well, but starving state government like it's happened the last 2 years it's getting really scary.
They're talking about rolling back the tax too.
Yes.
Another 1%.
I'm stunned. I know I was at a meeting a few years ago when they were talking about how on a Saturday night in Flint you might be hard-pressed to field a dozen police officers to police the entire city. There are literally swaths of the city that are just going unpoliced. I was part of the community policing movement for many years, and with the 2.3 million people behind bars, I can tell you that House Bill 5658 worries me because the prison industrial complex is very powerful. We incarcerate such a high percentage of our people. I think in some ways we treat the inner city drug dealer who has no other options as a sort of raw material for these corporations that take over and process them and use them as this low-cost labor. That, I mean, there are people out there struggling to make minimum wage jobs. Well, if you can have it done at a prison, well, that's about the cheapest labor you're going to get.
Yeah, that is really scary. And, there's legislation right now that would try to open private prisons here in Michigan. And, it's something that when you're taking away somebody's freedom, that is something that needs to be done by the state, by government, and not by controlled by private corporations. And, those type of things are scary. And you were talking about the police officers, for example, in Detroit, when they top out at maybe $50,000 a year to be an officer in Detroit, and then to ask them to take another 10% pay cut, or you're asking a correction officer to work within the facility and make $12, $13 an hour. You got to think that corruption starts to come into the equation, and we all suffer, and that's kind of the challenge that we're facing right now, and the thing is, we're not broke. That's the other misnomer.
Yeah, it
we're
is.
not. We fell off a cliff here in 2008 when the banks froze up, and everybody knows that. But actually, the revenues have been coming back a little bit. So there's really no reason to continue with the cuts. It really doesn't make sense. I mean, a lot of it is trying to bust collective bargaining units. A lot of it is, deals for people's friends and stuff like that. But, the state's not broke right now. We actually have a small surplus of money. So there's no reason to make these drastic cuts.
I was trying to explain to somebody the other day when they were talking about how the efficiencies of privatization. I said, look, when you take a service that's already being offered by the government and then you try to carve out a space for profit, government doesn't make a profit, but a private corporation must in order to be able to stay afloat. So where does that money come from? It comes from busting the unions and reducing the wages. And in the grand scheme of things, it means there's fewer dollars in people's hands to be able, except for the elites who can only eat so much butter. Right? But, fewer dollars in the hands of average citizens who are the engine of the growth in the culture. So I don't quite understand. I mean, it's ultimately a suicidal move on our part to keep starving people so that they're not able to make what they did before and fewer jobs. It's ultimately self-defeating. But apparently the 1% think they can move anywhere they want to, I guess. Even another planet if they pollute this one.
Yeah, it's true. And, one thing, too, when you're talking about privatization, let's say of a state service like child welfare, the state still ends up providing a lot of the administrative support, still ends up doing a lot of the work anyway. And so really you're not saving money. And sometimes private agencies, they, for example, get paid a per diem. So per day, they get a pay rate if they warehouse a child. Whereas, with a state worker, the goal is either to, move a child towards an adoption, a permanent home, or reunite the child with the biological parents. And it's not a for-profit mode, or it's not to make money. It's to do the right thing for the family, for the child, for the community. And unfortunately, whether it's conscious or unconscious, if you're making your money by warehousing kids, there's an incentive to keep the kids in foster care, keep the kids in a juvenile facility.
We saw that terrible case in Pennsylvania where the judge had colluded with the people who were providing a private juvenile facility, and they were taking kids who were basically just kids that would normally have never spent a day in any facility and sentencing them for a year. And then when they would get into trouble in the facility, they would have penalties added. And it was just because they were getting kickbacks from the private juvenile facility. And, one of the things that people don't realize, and I do think it's so unfortunate, it's again a case in many cases of trying to bleed the poor. I've seen families that have had to sell their home in order to pay the bill for it because they are charged for their child's incarceration.
Yeah, it's so true. And, and this budget too, there's 3 juvenile facilities that are state run. And they attempted to close all 3 down.
Yes.
And some of these facilities have youth that are sex offenders or have mental health issues. Yeah. And if they would have closed these facilities, some of these youth would have been put into adult prison, which is more expensive. They've blown through a lot of their private placements. So again, it doesn't make sense to do a lot of the stuff that individuals are advocating. There's this mentality that private is always better, but it's not the case, and it's not true. Private facilities are not always better. There needs to be a balance.
You're listening to WLNZ, LCC Radio, 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. We've been talking with Ray Holman, and now I'm really depressed.
He always brings such great
We have
news.
to bring Jim Carter back and go back to the philosophical and how positive everything is.
Well,
and I guess I'm going to go out and run about 12 miles tonight.
Well, you know what it made me? We need a Charles Dickens, so that's a pretty good segue into writing.
Okay, I'm going to let Bill segue.
Well, we've got a guest tonight that's going to talk to us about an idea to save the independent bookstore. And tell us a little bit about it and how you got involved.
All right, well, first of all, I'm Randy Pearson, and I'm part of a writing group out of Grand Ledge called Writing at the Ledges. And I've been a writer for a few years. I had a book came out a couple of years ago, and the writing group I'm with, we've self-published a couple of anthologies. And we've had a lot of dealings with the local bookstores over the past few years. found out that they're really the best place for local authors to sell. Not only can you go in and meet people on a regular basis, but they are, they're like, for instance, the Book Bodega. I bet you none of you have heard of the Book Bodega. It's a small little bookstore that's out in Wacusta.
Bill would know.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they're
Mr.
gone.
Bentley
They're gone. They
would know.
closed.
They
Yeah.
did, yes. Unfortunately. The thing is, with her, her name was Sue, who owned the store, and I actually ended up selling more copies of my book there than at any other bookstore, because people would walk in and they say, "Hey, what's new?" "Oh, this book here, Randy Pearson's book. You'll love this." And it was just nice that she would go out of her way to talk up the local authors. She had a little section just for us, So that was part of the reason why, when I began to realize that we're starting to lose all these little bookstores around here. And the actual catalyst for me for doing this was Everybody Reads, the bookstore in Michigan Avenue. I'm friends with the owner, Scott Harris. I've dealt with him since I've been writing. I've been talking with him, and recently I had a conversation with him that kind of made me sad. Found out that he's owned the bookstore for a little over 6 years now. Not only has he not made any money, he hasn't been able to take any money himself out of the store, but he had to go back to selling insurance full time at the Allstate agency just to keep his store alive. So he's got his.
So he's subsidizing it.
Yes, that's the sad thing to me, is that he's got this dream, his lifelong dream to own a bookstore. He has it. Now it's sitting off to the side while he's selling insurance. And so I got together with him and with my writing group, and we decided to do a nice little writing contest called Save the Independent Bookstore. The deal is, the word count is 1,111 words. Wanted to be a little unique there.
I was wondering how you arrived at that.
Well, I was born 11/11,
Oh,
so
okay.
11's well into my life quite a bit. But the deal here is that it's a short story contest. We're asking people to write stories that have something to do with a small town, local, independent bookstore. It doesn't have to be the main plot necessarily, but anything.
Weave it in something.
Yeah, exactly. Anything from walking by a store and saying, "Oh, that bookstore's closed," to having the characters work at the store, or whatever. I mean, and you can do anything you want with that. And so it's a $10 entry fee, and $5 of that goes into the winner's pot, which I can explain in a minute. But the other half of that money goes to the Capital Area Literacy Coalition. So we decided between Scott and myself that we didn't want to bring in any money ourselves. We didn't want to keep any of this money. So half of it goes to the winner. We're setting up as what you might call a 50-50 style contest, where for every $10, $5 goes into the winner's pot. The prize starts out at $50, and once we get 10 entries, then every $5 after that will bring the pot up by the $5. So at some point, what we're hoping to do is pull in, if we can get 60 people to enter this contest, we will bring in $300 for the contest. We're going to have a $150 first prize, $100 second prize, $50 third prize. And then the rest of the money, minus PayPal, unfortunately, is going to go to the Capital Area Literacy Coalition.
So give me an idea that if you were writing a short story, what would your story be? Because you probably can't enter. Can you?
Right, exactly.
So I'll steal them.
Okay, there we go. Like I said, there's lots of different possibilities. I think the idea of, I've always had the dream myself of owning a bookstore. And that's how I kind of got into the conversation with Scott about what would you do, like how could I start my own bookstore? And he gave me the Bookstore for Dummies book, and then gave me the speech that don't do this if you're trying to make money. This is not a way to make a living. This is, if you have a dream, do it. So I think my story would be about a person who starts a bookstore, does everything he can to make it survive, and not sure what happened from there, but I'm hoping good things. I like that happy ending.
Bill, you know so much about the book industry, and you're just back from New York from the book fair, where I'm sure a lot of these discussions take place. We've seen even the closing of big chains like Borders. What is the future of the physical bookstore?
Excellent question. The physical bookstore is still under threat. E-books are still taking a bite out of it, obviously. There's fewer books being sold in bookstores, even though bookstores had about a 3.8% rise this last month.
They did?
They did.
You mean in number of sales or in number of stores?
Dollars.
Oh, dollars.
The number of bookstores is declining every year, maybe 5%. And Borders did not help, obviously.
Right.
And the stores they left behind were large stores, typically, so they're hard to fill. They're not very many of them have been filled nationwide. But the future of a bookstore is you're going to see probably more stores like Schuler's, which sell lots of knickknacks. And that's where they make their money.
They're looking at a different mix of products.
Right. And what's happened, one of the things that's happened, just as an example, say James Patterson is probably the number one best-selling authors in the country. He sells 80% of his books are now ebooks.
80%.
So, and that was the big money. See, that was the big money for bookstores. You'd go in and buy those bestsellers, even at 40% off. That's not happening like that anymore.
That's where Sam's Club took a bite too, because
yes, absolutely. Yeah. So I mean,
between the
there's a
discount
lot of
houses
them
and
like
the
that. Janet
ebooks,
Ivanovich, top bestsellers are ebooks now.
But it would seem there might be a niche for something like a little book bodega or a Scott Harris Everybody Reads, where it's about the community hub and it does other things and
exactly. That's the whole point, I think, is that in today's business model, I don't think you can just sell books and survive. I don't think that's possible. I mean, yes, you can sell your ebooks or your e-readers anyway, because you really can't sell the ebooks through a store. I mean, I can't. I've been trying to work that through the model.
It doesn't make sense. And even if there's some that are trying to do that, it doesn't make sense. I mean, people ultimately are going to figure it out. They can do it themselves.
Amazon is not going to want to share with you.
No, exactly.
Amazon has even opened a couple stores.
And did they do well? Probably not.
Well, Seattle and
well, I think there are probably a few famous ones. I mean, there's the Strand in New York. And,
I was just there.
Yeah.
18 miles of books, but that's a used bookstore primarily. And I noticed their first floor is almost all knickknacks now.
Is it really?
It's souvenirs.
I didn't know
of the Strand. Very clever.
And if you've been, I made my pilgrimage many years ago to the City Lights bookstore in San Francisco and was surprised to find out it's a cubbyhole.
It's like you could fit it in this room. Yeah, it's very tiny.
All 6 books you could buy.
Yeah, it's really small. I had that same impression. I was standing outside and went, wow.
Yeah. The book bodega was the same way. It was a closet, like literally a closet. But there were times where we had a reading out there, and I think we had to go outside to do the reading.
Well, that's one of the things I think, is that sense of community, though, that builds up around a bookstore. Many of us, the loss of Jock Andres in East Lansing was a huge loss. I mean, that was a place where you ran into people and you saw people you knew and people that were like-minded. You'd find yourself at the same shelves, that kind of thing.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Scott runs Everybody Reads as a community.
Yes,
he read his mission statement. That it's not about selling books. It's about being there for the community.
Yeah.
He has all sorts of vegan potluck dinners and again, he brings in all the local authors to do signings.
Another thing that's helped some bookstores, say Schuler's is one, Nicola's in Ann Arbor, and Agatha's in Ann Arbor, is off-site sales of authors at universities.
Oh.
How does that work?
Well, like Wharton Center, when they have an author come in, a bookstore will sell the books.
Oh,
it's
really?
Been huge for books.
Oh, that's a good idea. Oh, so when they come in to do a reading or something, it's the bookstore that sets up the display?
Right. And universities are not doing that business themselves. They're letting the private sector do it. They're not going to try to. It's silly for them to compete.
It would just be more of a problem for them.
It'd be a problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they don't know what to do with books when they're left over.
Well, yeah, they would. Yeah, it's a little bit more complicated.
Now you've got you're going to have the Writing at the Ledges has got a new book coming out, right? Probably in the fall.
We're expecting by the end of the year. It's going to be called Voices from the Ledges, and it's again going to be an anthology like we've done with our first 2. So. Our writing group at this point, the last book, Seasons of Life, we had 24 authors. We went from 14 authors in small towns, our first book in a way, to 24 authors. We figured we can't have too many more than that in the book because the picture on the back was, heads were like really tiny. Like, you had to use a magnifying glass to see, hey, that's me, isn't it? Yes. But yeah, actually part of the contest, the winners of the contest on top of the money that they receive will also be published in that book. And we'll also get a free copy of the book as well.
Now, if somebody wants to, if they Google Writing at the Ledges, that will take them to a website where they can find out about the contest?
Oh, most definitely. Or if they go to writingattheledges.com.
Oh, well, that's a good
word. There's a link right there for the writing contest.
One of the important things we've left out is the deadline for entry.
Deadline is July 31st.
And who's going to judge these?
Oh, yes. Well, the way it's working right now is it's going to be myself, Rosalie Perkowski, who's the other member of Writing at the Ledges, and Scott Harris. The 3 of us together are going to read like a third of all the pieces because we're expecting hundreds and hundreds of entries. I'm sure. And then we're going to pick the ones we like the best. And then we have a special celebrity judge. You all might know John Schneider, former Lansing Journal columnist. Yeah, he's going to read and he'll be the final judge.
So he's going to be the final authority, have the final say. Oh, that's great. Yeah. What's he keeping him busy in his retirement?
He has a blog. JohnSchneiderBlog.com.
Ah.
Keeping him busy.
We should have him on our show.
We had Mike Hughes on. We
Yeah.
have all the, and they have all become bloggers.
Yes.
And all of them,
I
for
believe
many
his-
years worried about blogs. Now they've become one.
I believe his website is called John Schneider Has Something Left to Say. And most writers do. We may want to say that we're done writing, but no. Even Stephen King. There's always another book, another 2 books.
Well, I was sad to see today that Gretchen Millich is leaving Michigan Public Radio. She's retiring or leaving there on this month, and I thought, oh gee, we're losing a lot of the people, but maybe we'll just have them all on the show. Thank you very much to Ray Holman of the UAW. We're going to keep our eye on Senate Bill 704 and House Bill 5658. And we need you there keeping an eye on these things for us. Thanks to Jim Carter talking about the Lansing Marathon. And thank you very much for coming on, Doug Pearson, talking about writing at the ledges and the upcoming contest. This is Lansing Online News Radio, WLNZ 89.7 LCC Radio. Come back next Monday night. We've got a surprise for you. We're going to have our youngest guest next week.